So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you guys are watching from. I hope you guys are all doing very, very well. Welcome back to a new video, and today we're talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is 90s minimalism. Now, as someone who was born in the late 90s, it may be a little bit biased for me to say, but the 90s was truly the most influential and significant eras that we've ever had. And minimalism became a hallmark of this decade, not just embracing fashion, but embracing music and design as well as other areas of life. So in today's video, we're gonna talk a little bit about how 90s minimalism came to be, why it still captivates us, and how it connects to deeper ideas about life, art, and identity. I talk a lot about minimalism on this channel, and I'll also share a little bit about my journey into minimalism. I'll also highlight often overlooked Black figures who embodied and shaped this really timeless aesthetic. So by the late 1980s, fashion had peaked in extravagance. We had big hair, shoulder pads, glitzy sequins, and this hyper materialistic vibe. And the economic euphoria of the 80s had started to really wane. The cultural pendulum swung from more is more to something more understated. The 90s ushered in a wave of recession fears, which fueled a desire for simplicity and practicality. That translated into minimalist silhouettes. So suddenly designers like Calvin Klein, Jill Sander, Donna Karan from DKNY, and Helmut Lang found themselves at the forefront with these sleek designs, neutral palettes, and an ethos of less but better.
I thought it was beautiful. I love that he used black again. I think a lot of women are happy that he did.
I actually like the way that it went back to simplicity. Absolutely perfect, fine, delicate clothing, beautiful fabrics, and most of all, just clean faces. Yeah, people can look like that.
Sometimes you stray, and sometimes you want to make a point about fashion and things get complicated and it makes no sense. And I wanted this time for it to be really pure clothes that women can wear and that make perfect sense, and at the same time show these clothes on women of all ages, because they're not just for little waifs.
And what I find so interesting is that this minimal shift wasn't just confined to fashion, but we also saw this in architecture as well. And things moved towards more of a stripped down format. So if you think Tadao Ando's concrete sanctuaries, or these sort of stark open spaces in homes featured in a lot of design magazines at the time, even photography moved to this more, I would say, cleaner approach. We saw things shot more in black and white. And the overarching sentiment was that we were really just reaching an age where we were craving a reset, a sense of calm amid rapid globalization and the birth of the internet age. One of my personal favorite shifts of this era was in R&B. And what we saw were these more understated and simpler backdrops in music videos. One of my favorite artists to reference when talking about this topic is Shanice, especially in the music video I Love Your Smile. You just see these very simple, laid back looks. You see blue jeans, you see t-shirts, and then you also see a big focus on the dancing, of the concept of the music video, of the music itself. We also look at artists like Diana King, especially with the music video Shy Guy.
I don't want no fly guy, I just want a shy guy. Mercy, mercy, the man, them inna the party, party, party. The whole of them sexy, sexy.
You see a lot of it shot in black and white. You see these black suits, and you see this overall very simple aesthetic. Another one of my favorite examples of this minimalism, especially in music and R&B at the time, was of course the late, great Aaliyah. And Aaliyah really was one of the artists that embraced this element of minimalism through music and through sound as well. We saw that through her very much pared back and laid back melodic approach through her music. I feel like when we look at a lot of articles that discuss the topic of 90s minimalism, you can't really look at an article or YouTube video that talks about minimalism without hearing the names Carolyn Kennedy or Kate Moss. And while these ladies are of course iconic in the sense of the 90s minimalist aesthetic, there are so many other influential figures that we don't really talk about when it comes to this 90s minimalist aesthetic. And And one of the most iconic, or a few of the most iconic figures of the time for me are, of course, Naomi Campbell, who arguably was the defining supermodel of the era. She effortlessly blended high fashion minimalism into the infamous quote-unquote off-duty look, and she was often captured in simple slip dresses or these monochrome sets. Another very much favorite of mine, and I'm sure a favorite of a lot of men out there, of course, was Halle Berry, who a lot of us fantasized over at the time. Halle Berry personified this red carpet minimalism with these sleek silhouettes that highlighted her figure without over embellishment. Another personal favorite that comes to mind is Sade, of course, who we can all really appreciate when it comes to the topic of minimalism. This very much, this very bold red lip paired with her signature hoop earrings, effortless denim and white shirt combo. She became a living embodiment of this understated cool. Meanwhile, you had the likes of Lisa, who showcased a bohemian twist on minimal style, earthy tones, unfussy layers, and natural textures. Although less documented, you have a handful of Black designers who contributed to or paralleled the minimalist movement. For instance, you have Willy Smith, though he passed away in 1987, he'd laid the groundwork for accessible, clean line sportswear in the 80s. And then you had Ozwald Boateng, who of course was more known for this Savile Row tailoring. He integrated refined cuts and muted palettes in menswear and bridged minimalism with this sharp London style. So while not always heralded in mainstream minimalism retrospectives, these Black figures expanded the definition and cultural reach of minimalist style in the 90s. Now, if you want to just spotlight some designers and really look at the masters in fashion design at the time of this 90s minimalist aesthetic, of course we have Helmut Lang and Donna Karan, Calvin Klein. You can't go without mentioning these names, these household names at the time. But for me, Jill Sander really was the person that championed this purity of form and quiet luxury. Her collections were famously devoid of any frills, and they really honed in and focused on the perfect cut and fabric. What I also love so much about this era is that even though you had the likes of Jill Sander really pushing this minimalist approach at the time, on the other hand, still in the category of minimalism, you had Tom Ford at Gucci, who was also playing on this idea of minimalism, but in a much more sort of sexy and daring way. And I feel like Tom Ford really spiced things up at the time. We saw things like plunging necklines, this sumptuous velvet and sleek tailored pants. And then kind of in this third category, we saw Miuccia at Prada pushing more of an intellectual sort of minimalism. And what was really interesting about what Miuccia did is she would almost subvert or contradict this element of minimalism through the use of unexpected fabrics or eccentric details here and there. Then on the other hand, you had the likes of Yohji Yamamoto and Issey Miyake, who were introducing the idea of Japanese minimalism to Western runways. And their work wasn't just a simple silhouette. Often it was an avant-garde approach, but intentionally pared down in color, primarily black, or this use of layering approaches. I feel like this is a really interesting segue into my own personal relationship with the idea of minimalism and minimalism in fashion, because I initially discovered the idea of minimalism before I would say, quote unquote, got into fashion. The answer for me lies in how this Japanese viewpoint of minimalism connects with my obsession and fascination with the late great Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs isn't exactly a 90s fashion model, but he's arguably the poster child. Well, in my opinion, he's arguably the poster child for this uniform aesthetic. We can see that, of course, in Steve's early design ethos and design approach for Apple in the 90s especially, and his push for simplicity, his push for uniform in design of the products. One thing that really is kind of like etched into my mind about Steve when he was talking about Apple products and Apple design is he talked about not just the external, the external products and how the product looks on the outside aesthetically, but he also referenced how the product looks on the inside. Although the outside is what people see and people don't necessarily see the inside, he still referenced and talked about how important it was for the inside of the product to also be as aesthetically pleasing as the outside of the product. And I think this concept really underlines how closely the art of design and the concept of minimalism were so closely connected for him. One of the most interesting things about Steve was his home. And there's this image that is always etched into my head and really is one of my favorite images ever is the image of Steve sitting in his home with just like nothing around him. He's just on the floor and he pretty much has almost no furniture. And his house usually remained empty for the most part. He fixated on the essential and he filtered out distractions to focus on creativity. And if we want to look at it from more of a fashion perspective, we can even look at the relationship between Steve and the late great Issey Miyake. I think Steve was visiting the Sony headquarters in Japan and he saw the uniforms of Sony staff at the time, and he asked, I think the Sony executives, who had designed the Sony uniform because he loved it so much. The Sony executive said that it was Issey Miyake, and then Steve then approached Issey Miyake to create uniforms for Apple employees. And I think the story goes that Steve essentially presented the uniforms to Apple employees and it was not received very well, and the employees just were just not on board with the idea of having these uniforms. What then happened is Steve then had asked Issey Miyake to create some turtlenecks for him. That's where the iconic Steve Jobs turtleneck comes from, which is just a very, very simple but very, very well designed black turtleneck. Because Steve was so obsessed with the idea of uniform, he asked Issey to make turtlenecks for him, and that's pretty much all he wore in his closet, and he had tons of these turtlenecks. That is where this iconic style of Steve Jobs, the turtleneck and the jeans, comes from. So in essence, Steve's brand of minimalism was really wrapped in this push for clarity and efficiency. And it was this same spirit that underpinned so many 90s runway collections at the time. So remember this point because I'm going to reference this again in a moment. But when we look at everything holistically, minimalism at the time was more so a lifestyle choice and concept than just an aesthetic. It was really about paring down so the truly important things in life, like ideas and relationships, or in fashion's case, the actual garment, could truly stand out. So if we fast forward to 2025, the question for a lot of people is, what is minimalism today? And I'm going to bring up a Threads conversation or a Threads post from a friend, Garrett. And Garrett, it's so funny because I saw this post probably 2 hours before I started recording this video. I feel like it's so tough for me to get through one of these videos without referencing a conversation that I saw on Threads, but I just do because a lot of the most interesting fashion discourse for me, I find, is on Threads. And it wasn't so much about this post by Garrett, aka Soaring Spear, that I found interesting, but it was more so the responses within the thread, because I feel like it really gave an idea of what I think a lot of people, especially younger people, especially let's say Gen Z, feel like minimalism is. I found it interesting that people saw minimalism as a reaction to the rise in conservatism, people feeling the need to sort of fit in. I think she definitely alluded to, in her opinion, the idea of the minimalists not putting as much effort into their outfits. And then another person said that the masses were able to afford logos, so alluding to the economic state of the world right now.
Oh my God, can we talk about the political and economic state of the world right now?
And then another person here talks about how this is more so alluding to quiet luxury and the quiet luxury aesthetic that we saw that was very, very much alive and kicking through 2020 to 2022, and which is still kind of going now as well, and kind of more so alluding to the concept of people trying to signal wealth that they may or may not have had through how they were dressing through the form of quiet luxury, which I think a lot of quiet luxury actually was about. So I think it's safe to say that I've been very open about my minimalist approach to fashion and life quite a lot on this channel, but I find it really interesting to always understand and take in different perspectives and points of view, especially when it relates to something that I find myself very much attracted to and drawn towards, just because I think it's a really fun exercise to kind of challenge your own biases and your own maybe preconceptions to this idea that you're attracted to. But the reason why I wanted to reference this Threads conversation in this video is because I think this is a really clear example of how a lot of young people, especially Gen Z, feel towards the idea of minimalism today. But for me, when I ask myself the question, what is minimalism in 2025? All I can see is that we're really just drowning in digital overload. We're bombarded with these 24/7 news cycles. We have these endless social media feeds with content from almost anywhere that can just show up in your face, and these very much chaotic daily schedules. And this is not to mention that divisive politics, wars, economic crisis were not a thing of the past, because they definitely were. It's just to say that now with the internet, a lot of these issues and a lot of these ideas are a lot more in your face than they once were, which makes dealing with them a lot harder, especially when the internet is ingrained into our lives in the way that it is. But for me, it's so important to mention that minimalism isn't a reaction to anything, and it's so much more than just a style trend. It can be a philosophical stance. And as we talked about, it represents a rejection of clutter in all forms, be it digital, physical, or emotional. The reason it remains so timeless, the reason so many of us are obsessed with Japan, going to Japan and Japanese culture and Japanese way of life, is because every generation eventually seeks refuge and solace from the craze and the bustle, and minimalism provides for many that breath of fresh air. So that is 90s minimalism, born from economic shifts and a signal of society seeking calm whenever chaos peaks. So let me know down in the comments if you've ever tried the minimalist approach, or you've ever tried living with less and how that went for you. Also, let me know who some of your favorite style icons are from the 90s and how they inspired you. And I'm always interested in hearing different points of view towards what minimalism means for everyone in 2025. So let me know your opinions on that as well. Other than that, thank you guys so much for tuning in and for watching today's video, and I'll see you very, very, very soon. All the best.